So, big word for you this morning. You ready? I want to know if there's anybody in the house that knows what thanatophobia is. Thanatophobia. There's a fear, right? Fear of. The phobia kind of gives that away. Fear of the word than. I don't know. Thanatophobia. It's the fear of losing your pastor. So actually it means the fear of losing someone you love, which I hope includes your pastors. Maybe not right now. I don't know. So FOMO, right? You know what FOMO is, the fear of missing out. Michelle gave us a clue this week that this morning we'd be talking about FOPL. That's the fear of your pastor leaving. And by some of the hesitation in your laughter this morning, I sense that it's still too early to use this joke for some of you. Some of you started like twitching when I said it, and some of you need a support group. But I'm glad that you're here this morning because we're going to address this. So first of all, let me put you at ease. You're going to put me out to pasture with retired pastors. I'm not going anywhere, right? So the reality is when no. That's not for your applause. That's just reality, right? So I'm trying to put you at ease. I'm going to be old and decrepit, and you're going to be asking, when is this guy going to leave, right? When you push me out of here, all right? So let me put you at ease there. But also, second, I want to offer some help from our text this morning, because thanatophobia is actually at the center of our final story in our study of Elisha this morning. Many of you have shared with me how much you've appreciated this study that we started at the beginning of the year. And we've all become pretty fond, I know I have, of Elisha as a prophet that I really, quite frankly, didn't know a lot about as we started. And it's been fun to discover. It's been fun to discover the amazing stories of his life and of his ministry. It's been amazing to discover hope in our own lives through his words and by his actions as they have portrayed the power of God to make all things new. But our fondness, I would venture to guess, would pale in comparison to the love that the people of God had for him in the day in which he lived. The hope that he spoke even during his ministry, even the hope that he displayed through numerous miracles. In fact, we will see today even some who didn't really like him were scared about his passing, about his going. There was a severe case of thanatophobia in Israel as Elisha faces his final days. And so this morning, we turn to that text. It's in 2 Kings 13. I'll give you a moment to get there on your electronic devices or the Bibles in your pews or the Bible that you brought with you this morning. 2 Kings 13, verses 14 through 21. As you go there, let me kind of give you the outline. You might look for it as we share in God's Word. This text focuses on a main question with two answers, and that makes 3 points, which is a really good Presbyterian sermon, right? A main question with two answers. You might listen for that as we read God's Word. 2 Kings 13, starting in verse 14. This is the very Word of God. Now when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. So he took a bow and arrows. And then he said to the king of Israel, draw the bow. And he drew it. And Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. And he said, open the window eastward. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot. And he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight the Syrians in Aphek until you have made an end of them. And he said, take the arrows. And he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground with them. And he struck 3 times and stopped. Then the man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times, then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times." So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year, and as men were being buried, behold, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. You can't wait to know what this is saying, right? Is this not a great way to end Elisha? All right, so let's get to it. What's the main question? What's the main question? The main question in this text is, how in the world do we go on? And they're asking the question, Joash is asking the question of, how do we go on without you, Elisha? I want you to see that. I want you to note that some time has passed. Last week, as we studied Elisha's life, and all the weeks prior to that, we were kind of in succession. This is just chapter after chapter, story after story, and we get to chapter 8, and now there's this long gap till chapter 13 before we see Elisha again. So what's happening in these 5 chapters? Well, a lot of time has passed. There have been a number of kings and a number of years that have gone by where we've been relatively silent with regard to the life of Elisha. As we come to chapter 13, we find that Elisha is old. Some commentators have him at 120 years old. That's to make some of you who are old feel better. I'm not calling you old. Elisha is old. They think he might have been about 120 years old. He is sick, and he's sick with an illness that will eventually kill him. He will not arise as Elijah did in chariots of fire, right? In the reality of all of these grandeur of just being taken up into heaven. He will live a full life, and he will die a natural death. And so here's Elisha on his deathbed, and here comes King Joash. Who in the world is King Joash? Well, I'll tell you, he's a king of Israel, and if you know anything about the kings of Israel, there wasn't a good one. In fact, after every king of Israel, it clarifies that this king did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he was usually doing the evil that his father did, and that his grandfather did, then his great-grandfather did, and they're setting up temples, and they're setting up idols, and they're setting up all kinds of things, and King Joash is in that family. He is like every other king. He's doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So read in this that Joash is probably not a great friend of Elisha. But we see an unusual thing, right? Joash comes and he weeps over Elisha. And then he says this really odd statement, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. So a couple of things that help us understand this unusual goodbye, that help us get to the main question of this text. First, realize that all of the evil things that were prophesied in chapter 8 that we saw disturbingly last week on Mother's Day, all the things that Hazael said would come true have come true. Those evils have been carried out. And not only has there been war with Syria and Hazael, but also with Judah in this time frame. And as we will see, there are other raiding parties coming upon Israel as well. Israel is depleted in their resources. They are down to their last horsemen, their last chariots, their last hope, their last breath. They are desperate. And things are getting worse by the day. And desperate times call for desperate measures, so Joash goes to someone who has helped before. Elisha, a miracle worker. And so he thinks, this is my hope. This is how something might change. Maybe he can do something, but he finds him dying in his bed. So imagine a desperate king with one last hope, and he finds that that last hope is waning as well. Joash's weeping then is logical. But what with the weird saying? My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Well, that should sound familiar if you've been tracking with us. So you would have to go back, I think, to February to hear it. But the reality is it's a repeated phrase in the scripture. It's the very words, listen, that Elisha cried out when Elijah, his predecessor and mentor, was taken up into heaven. And he said them in grief in watching his mentor and predecessor being taken up into heaven. But he also said them because it's exactly what he saw. He saw chariots and fire and horsemen. And so Elisha is grieving over the taking of Elijah, but he is saying, in essence, what's going to happen now? So let's give Joash a little credit here. He's been told about this miraculous occasion, an occasion that was well before he would have been even born, and he has remembered it. And so as he comes, and in this waning place of hope, this last gasp for some desperate hope, he sees Elisha dying, and he repeats the words that Elisha said to Elijah, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. So here's the main question that I believe that we can draw from that statement. The question of Joash is this: Elisha, how will we survive without you? How will we go on? It was a legitimate focal moment, right? The fear of your pastor leaving. It was genuinely thanatophobia, the fear of losing someone whom you had some measure of hope in. And I'm assuming that if you're here this morning or online, that many of you have had moments of loss that are like this. When significant people in your life have passed, and we have wondered how we would ever get on. Or even when significant people in your lives have moved away, or pastors that have left churches. But I want to encourage you this morning and press in a bit this morning that even if that has not happened in your life, you might resonate with the feeling of Joash here as a feeling of not knowing how you might go on for any number of reasons. Maybe it's the loss of a job. Any number of dead ends in your life could seemingly come up as you think about how it is that I might go on. Maybe there is a battle that you are facing, a battle with sin, a battle with depression, a battle with anxiety, a battle with culture, and your resources are running low and you're wondering about how you might be able to sustain the fight. Welcome to how Joash felt in that moment. Ultimately, it is a place in which we have lost hope. It's where Joash is as he weeps over Elisha. Even though they were not friends, I think Joash at least thought he had the man of God in his hip pocket somehow if he needed him. But now he is dying and Joash is out of hope. And he is asking the main question: how will we go on? Well, Elisha, in the midst of that question, seems to rally a bit, and he gives essentially two answers. So if you're in that place this morning, how will I go on? It's a severe place, it's a hard place, and yet there are answers that Elisha gives us. The first answer is this: do the next right thing. Do the next right thing. Observation here in this text, Elisha doesn't look at Joash, the evil king, who has ignored him for years and has even done some evil things rather than right things. And he what he doesn't say is what I might have said is like, how dare you come now, you get out of here. I mean, I don't know, if we're being honest, some of us might have given that answer, like, consequences, dude, done with you. But that's not what he says. What does he do? Elisha begins to give him instructions. It seems weird if you really think about it. And the text is very interesting here. It's choppy. Elisha says, do something, and Joash does it. You see it? Then he says, do something else, and Joash does it, and it keeps going. He says, take a bow and arrows. So Joash takes a bow and arrows. Draw the bow, and he drew it. Open the window eastward, the direction of the arch enemy of Syria, and he opened it. Shoot, and he shot. Joash just starts following instructions. Feel the pace of that. Elisha, as a good counselor here, does not say, like, suck it up, buttercup. He doesn't just say, hey, go get the Syrians. He doesn't even give a small lecture on following God. He just asked Joash to do the next right thing. And hope comes as a result of doing that next right thing. Elisha finally reveals the meaning of all of this. It seems weird. You're dying. I'm out of hope. And I'm in your bedroom. And you say, take up an arrow and shoot it out of a window. That just does not seem to make sense. But Elisha then reveals and he says, listen, this is symbolic. This is a reality, Joash. I'm telling you that indeed you will have victory over the Syrians. This whole arrow out the window thing carries significance. Listen, hope can be found again in our battles when we simply begin to do the next right thing. But let's keep going in the story. Elisha tells Joash to take arrows, and he took them, and he said to strike the ground with them. And our text says that Joash struck the ground 3 times, and then it makes this very clear indication that he stopped. And how did Elisha respond? He was angry. He's responding now. You hear it? Sorry. It's just kidding. So listen, he got ticked. Why is Elisha, who identified here as the man of God, seemingly to say that it is a moment that he literally speaks for God, why is he so angry when he stops at 3 arrows? Great question. I think this is the answer. Joash does the next right thing, but he only does it part way. He only does it, he's on a roll. But when he's told to strike the ground with the arrows, he's to use all of the arrows that he has in his bag to strike the ground. And Joash stops at 3. We're not sure why. Maybe his arm was tired from shooting arrows into the ground. Maybe he thought 3 was enough. Maybe he thought 1 was enough, but he did 2 for extra good measure. I don't know what he's thinking. But he didn't use all of the arrows in his bag. God reveals an important lesson to us in his anger, in Elisha's anger. It's someone who stopped short when it comes to doing the next right thing. How many times, I'll press in, how many times in life when hopelessness comes that we begin to do the next right thing, but when hope starts to come back, what do? We kind of go back to the very place that created us to be hopeless in the first place, right? So, oh man, I need you, Jesus. Run to Jesus. I'll meet with you anywhere. I love you, love you, love you. I'll go to church 2 consecutive Sundays. Yes, 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 yes. And all of a sudden, things start looking good. All right, well, now that that's taken care of, I'll just wander back over here, right? So the reality is that so often in our life, our hopelessness leads us to doing the next right thing. We begin to do the next right thing, begin to regain hope, and then we return to hopelessness. I don't know about you. I live in that cycle. Joash is evidence of that cycle. I've said this before, but some of my greatest heroes in life are friends that I have that battle the life of addiction. Say it again. Some of my greatest heroes in life, some of my mentors, some of the people that have taught me the most about Jesus are those who continually fight a battle of addiction. The principle of doing the next right thing is actually a stolen principle from AA and NA, right? It's like not in the Bible per se, but comes from the scriptures to people who have learned that the only way free from their addiction is simply not thinking about the end game, but thinking about the next minute and doing the next right thing. And they have to exercise it with diligence, because if they don't, if they stop short, if they only shoot 3 arrows, it could literally cost them their lives. I've unfortunately seen the reality of that. But I've also seen the marvelous example of men and women who continue to shoot all of their arrows into the ground in their battle against drugs and alcohol. And in our battles against hopelessness, we not only have to do the next right thing, but we have to keep doing it, and we have to do it all the way. We cannot stop short. Why is God angry over Joash stopping short? Just because he didn't follow directions? No. It was also symbolic. The 3 arrows that he put in the ground were evidence that Israel would defeat Syria 3 times, which they did. If you look at the end of this text, I didn't read all the way to it, but in verse 25, at the end of verse 25, it says that Israel defeated Syria 3 times because there were 3 arrows that went. But then the longer story is that Syria, the Assyrians, eventually come and conquer Israel, destroy them. There are consequences. Why is God angry? Why is Elisha angry? Because Joash stopped short in the promise of God. And God is angered because his people will suffer due to their disobedience, of not going all the way, of not shooting all their arrows, of stopping short and falling back into the pattern of hopelessness. So, answer 1 from Elisha: do the next right thing and keep doing it. The second answer that I think we see in this text is this: receive from the reservoir of God's power. The second answer to the question of how can I go on is not a verbal one from Elisha, but rather something that he does. And then something that happens even after he dies, that the historian who tells the story gives us as a very special kind of exclamation point to Elisha's life. More on that in a second. So here's the point before I show you the scripture here. God, listen, God is ever present in our lives to give us all we need to do the next right thing and to do it all the way. Hear that? God is ever present and always enough to empower us to do the next right thing and to do it all the way. Notice the very important phrase that I left out when talking about Joash doing the next right thing in verse 16. It says, Joash took the bow and drew it. And what does it say Elisha did? It says he got off his bed and went over to Joash, listen, and laid his hands on his. Now think about this. Did Joash need help drawing the bow? Well, not from a guy who's almost dead, right? Not from a guy who's sick and to the point of death. It was not that he needed help in drawing the bow. So why in the world does Elisha get up and go and lay his hands on Joash as he did it? Because Elisha is there saying, not my power, but God's power. I stand as a prophet of the living God that says, as you are obedient in the things that you do, here is the power of God that will enable you to do it. Receive it, Joash. Receive it. It is a picture of God being present in our obedience, a picture of God's blessing and power upon our best but broken efforts to doing things right. So see it, feel it this morning. Maybe receive it this morning as we seek to do the next right thing. It is God who comes behind us and around us and over us and under us in all of our best efforts, and he puts his hand on ours. And this is ultimately, listen, how we will be able to do the next right thing. It's how we'll be able to move forward. This is how we will win our battles. This is how we will find hope in our hopelessness. Because of God and his presence and his power in doing the next right thing. The examples are endless in the scriptures of this reality. I think of Exodus 17 as Moses leads Israel against the Amalekites. Do you remember this story? That the armies of Israel go out to face an army that is larger than them, and Moses goes up on the mountain and he takes the staff, which is the presence of God, and he holds it, and as long as what? The staff is above his head, his arms are up, the armies of Israel prevail. But as time goes on, the battle wanes and his arms begin to fall, and the more that his arms begin to fall is the reality of the Amalekites beginning to prevail against Israel. So Aaron and Hur, who are there, pull up a stone for Moses, say, have a seat, pal, let us hold your arms high. And in that, the reality of the presence and the power of God that eventually allows the Israelite army to defeat the Amalekites. It's an amazing story. I think of Romans chapter 8, verse 26 that says this, likewise the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought. You ever been there? don't know how to pray. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. We're doing the next right thing. We're praying. But when we get to the end of our rope in the midst of that prayer, how is it that we will carry on? Then it is indeed the Spirit of God that comes and prays in our spirit those things to God which helps us in our struggle. I don't think Joash got, when he felt Elisha's hands, I don't think he got it. Maybe even been a little weirded out, like, dude, you probably should lay down. And listen, it's still a huge theological debate. A debate over what comes first. You ready? We'll just dip our toe in it this morning. What comes first? God's power or man's responsibility? God's sovereignty or man's actions? Does God move us to obedience, or does our obedience move God to action? Woo! We should have a 15-week Sunday school class on that one. But I got the answer for you. Aren't you glad you came this morning? It's a bit oversimplified answer. Here's the answer. Is it God's power or my action? What comes first? And I say this, it's both. That's a really disappointing answer to you, isn't it? God, listen, God rarely moves in a straight line like we would like him to. Like, okay, this comes first, this comes second. No, God kind of goes, right? And it's like a big jigsaw puzzle that you feel like God's just throwing pieces at the wall. You ever feel like that? Like, this ain't coming together. I'm trying to do the right thing, but this doesn't really make sense. And then all of a sudden you step back one day and like there's a complete jigsaw puzzle on the wall that's like, he's done it. How did that happen? Was it me? No, not really. Was it him? Well, I sort of did something. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. So it's both. Listen, don't try to think so linear and figure out theologically. Joash is in a place he's going, listen, is it because I did the right thing or God's presence? Listen, it's both. So do we obey and God bless us, or does God bless us and we obey? The answer is yes, and he even does it with someone, listen, who is not his biggest fan in this text. In our hopelessness, we must be asking, what is the next right thing, and be about it. But even more, recognize that we're only a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Be aware of the power of God in that moment, who puts his hands on ours to ultimately give us victory. And the historian, the author, makes it clear in this text that this is clearly God and not Elisha, doesn't he? Because consider, finally, this last crazy story that ends the account of Elisha in the scriptures. Elisha has died. Seems a little abrupt, right? We just had this bow and arrow thing. Now Elisha's dead. What's the historian trying to tell us? Listen, it's not Elisha, it's God, and I'll prove it. Elisha, he has died, and he's buried in a cave. And there's a small band of Israelite men, sadly, right, burying a friend. But as they do, a band of Moabites, enemies, are seen coming over the hill. Sorry to laugh, this really isn't funny. But it's just the picture of it, like, uh-oh. So in haste, what do? They take their buddy and throw him in a cave. We're out of here. Sorry, Charlie. Go on, right? Well, as the body, get this, are you ready? I don't know if you heard this. The body lands in the cave, it comes in contact with the bones of Elisha. He's been there a while. It comes in contact with his bones, and the man is revived, and he stands to his feet. Oh my goodness. Now, this is all we're told about the story. I want to know more, right? But we don't need to know more, because the reason for this story is certain, is clear. And it's important today for our phobia and for our thanatophobia, because it is not Elisha that has the power, but the God of Elisha. So that person that has passed, the person that has left, that has meant so much to you, that has invested so much into you, do not despair in the loss of that person, for the power of God in that person lives on. And he's the God who will revive you. He is the God who will grant you hope. Get the obvious. We are not and cannot be dependent on a person for our spiritual power. And likewise, our spiritual power does not leave with anyone else. Our power is from God and from God alone. Josiah's question, our question, is answered here. We need only trust God for the needed power in our lives to win our battles. Hear that? But hear even more, that power is a resurrection power. It is a power that brings death back to life. Oh, there's a great gospel message here. I so badly, when I was mapping out this series, wanted this story to be on Easter Sunday. Wouldn't that have been cool? Your pastor wasn't good enough to fit it all in before Easter, so here we are in May. But can you hear that message? That we were dead in our sins, but that by the grace of God, through the death and resurrection of Jesus, that we are made alive in him, that in essence, our souls, our bodies, our lives have touched Christ who has died for us and who has risen for us, and therefore we rise again with him. That's a whole other sermon, but some cliff notes. This is a picture of our salvation. We were dead, and yet when thrown upon the power of Jesus in the resurrection, we are made alive. And it is evident in all the scriptures of the New Testament that we are reassured that in us is that resurrection power. That as we have been raised in that power from death to life, that we hold that power in our lives to overcome hopelessness, to win our battles, to move on from even the hardest of things. To say we can't is to say that God is not enough. And people of God, that is a lie, because God is always sufficient. He is always enough. Listen, just ask the dead guy who got thrown into the cave. I so badly want to interview him. Like, what did you think like when you first hit the bones and came to? Like, you're not even kind of laying there. Like, it says you're on your feet. Like, what's going through your head? How excited were you? Like, the last thing I remember, I was really sick. And now I'm in a cave with a dead man, but I'm alive. And I'm feeling pretty good. How excited are you? What did you do? Did you go out and take on the Moabite army? Like, feeling like there ain't nothing that's going to get me. Well, listen, we don't have to interview this dude. We just have to have a conversation with ourselves. You know why? Because you are that dude. Dead in your sins. But because of Christ, you are alive again. How does that make you feel? You excited? You ready to take on anything that might even bring hopelessness to the reality of your life? Knowing that Christ has not only set you free, but empowered you with resurrection power. As a people resurrected from death, we not only praise the one who has saved us, but we walk in a confidence that this God can do anything in our lives. So how will we go on in a place of hopelessness? It's a cool combo. Doing the next right thing as we receive and walk in the power of God. I did a wedding yesterday for an amazing Christian couple that made me feel really old. When I was in my previous church, when I went to the church, the bride that I married yesterday was 2 years old. So 19 years later, I'm watching her walk down the aisle with her dad, who is a good friend, right? Oftentimes at weddings, in the charge, in that message, I say hard things. Yesterday's was, listen, as love of God has pursued you, you need to pursue one another. And as the love of God has cleansed you, you need to be at work to cleanse one another. And man, you just load it on them. Like two people, I don't know that they heard anything I said. They were staring into each other's eyes like this, right? But the reality is like, I hope they got something like this is hard stuff. But I always feel bad when I get to the end and it's the hard stuff and I say, but you need to know something. As hard as this is, as impossible as this is to do on your own, receive from the reservoir of God's power to do these things. So I'll wrap up this morning the way I wrapped up yesterday's wedding message. It's a visual, a picture of God's love and power as a reservoir of living water that cannot be measured. Maybe like standing at the beach, only better. You cannot seemingly measure how long, how wide, how deep is the love of God. But then see in your life, see as your life, a raging stream that is fed by this reservoir. It's an active, class 5 rapid stream fed by the reservoir. Your stream is evidence of you doing the next right thing. But listen, it is filled not with your power, but with the resurrection power of God to give you all you need to do that next right thing. See it? The reservoir of God's power feeding your life as you do the next right thing. So, to steal some words from a spoken word that I heard this week, it says this: my God, His grace is remarkable, mercies are innumerable, strength is impenetrable. He is honorable, accountable, and favorable. He is searchable, yet unsearchable yet knowable. He's indefinable yet approachable, indescribable yet personal. He is beyond comprehension, further than imagination, constant through generations, and the keeper of every nation. This is the one, people of God, who feeds you in times when you lose hope. This was the message of Elisha to a people who had been told that they would be exiled. This was the message to the people in exile as they read these words. And it is the message of hope that we have today as we continue to study Elisha as a messenger of hope. God is making all things new. He's making you new as a messenger of that hope.